Briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor. Today, we will discuss Mexico-U.S. relations and what some consider a possible model for diplomacy in the Trump era. Donald Trump's preferred approach to dealing with most countries in the world is coercive diplomacy. He threatens consequences if others don't comply with his demands. However, Mexico has been somewhat of an exception to this rule, with its president, Claudia Sheinbaum, using what she calls a cool head and continuing to engage with Trump and his administration at various levels in negotiations. Sheinbaum's style of diplomacy, a third way, that is neither confrontation nor capitulation, has earned her some delays and exceptions in tariffs imposed by the US, and even praise from Trump, who is often ready to insult other world leaders and has called her a marvelous woman. A panel of experts will discuss why and how the Mexican president has kept the lines open with Trump and what is at stake for both countries. Our guests today are David R. Ayon. He's an expert in the politics of the US, Mexico, and Latin America. He's senior fellow at the Levy Center for the Study of Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University. And among his many other credits, a twice visiting research fellow for the Center for US Mexican Studies. He has a new book coming out in September, Forging Latino Power, The Politics of Inclusion, Backlash, and Resistance. Larry Rubin, President and Chairman of the Board of the American Society of Mexico, who will join us a little bit later. Alberto Diaz-Calleros is a professor at Freeman Spogli Institute and former director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford. Luis Alvarado, political analyst and former Republican campaign operative based in Los Angeles, now an independent. We are honored to have you all here today. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat and we'll answer them when time allows. So we begin with you, David. David, can you give us the gist of what has happened between the Mexican and US governments in recent months regarding tariffs, fentanyl, and the border? And can you do that in 10 minutes?
Well, I think you really have to go further back to understand what's happening now and what might happen in the future. And it goes back to the last year of the Peña Nieto administration, when Peña Nieto and his, now I'm even forgetting the cabinet position among his team that came to the conclusion the thing to do with Donald Trump as a candidate in 2015. Remember, he only announced his candidacy in June of 2015. But he had been talking about the Nafta as being the worst agreement ever negotiated. He really put that down. He made it really seem quite threatening to, you would have to say, is Mexico's fundamental economic model since the Carlos Salinas administration, which also had roots in the previous one to that. And what Mexico decided to do, what Peña Nieto did, was invite Trump to visit Mexico right on the eve of the fall 2016 campaign. I don't think there's any other way to read this as being a strategy of appeasement and of actually helping normalize Trump. That was his first, and for a long time, his only international visit at a time when most people agreed. Most Republicans thought that Trump was nuts, but he was able to present himself as potentially a statesman, a responsible statesman, in his visit to Los Pinos in August of 2016. That policy of appeasement has basically held ever since then. One measure of this was the fact that we already had, for the election, before Trump's election in 2016, in which he was making these threats about NAFTA, abrogating NAFTA, walking away from NAFTA, negotiations had already started because NAFTA had it put into it as its successor, the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement had sort of a timeline of when it's supposed to be adjusted or kind of renegotiated, but mainly just sort of making adjustments any number of years. For example, the USMCA is due to be renewed next year. I don't know that those talks have started in de pleno fully, but that is on the calendar. AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, before taking office, made it clear that he wanted the Peña Nieto administration to conclude negotiations for a new agreement, what became the USMCA, before he came to power, came to the presidency at that time. And not only was there that continuity in economic policy and in the atmospherics of the relationship with Trump, which I would really characterize probably as better understood as Mexico agreeing to help normalize Trump. But it is a form of appeasement in the textbook of diplomatic strategies. That's what it has been. So Peña Nieto, with that visit, helped Trump win, helped normalize him as a potential head of a superpower. The USMCA did not fundamentally change Nafta very much. So Claudia Sheinbaum inherits, I'm leaving out one thing here, is that AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, outdid Peña Nieto by return visit to Washington while Trump was president in what was it, the summer of 2020. That really was a major, I would say, again, another major sort of boost for the sake of normalizing the image and that sense of the relationship between Mexico and the United States. This is what Claudia Sheinbaum has inherited. And my best guess, none of us knows how she handles Trump directly in those phone calls and in those meetings. My best guess on this, though, is that she has probably conveyed to Trump that both of them, both Mexico and the US, both Trump and the Mexican government, and now 3 presidents in a row, have really invested in maintaining stability in the relationship, and that what Mexico has offered of great value to Trump is this sense of normalization, that he's not nuts, right? AMLO continued, for example, even after the election, after Sheinbaum was elected, but before she took office, he continued to say publicly, no, he's not going to do, Trump is not going to do those things he's talking about. It's politiquería, right? It was just campaign talk. So AMLO maintained that strategy of normalizing Trump all the way. Now, it would take a long time to go through just all the different changes threatened tariffs have gone through and the effect they've had, but they've had clear effects, both on the value of the peso and presumably, we don't have as good data on this as we do on the peso, foreign investment flows into Mexico. But those are the basic interests that Mexico has. And Mexico has, for now, 3 administrations in a row, chosen a path of trying to appease this threat in order to maintain foreign investment flows and the value of the peso. The biggest thing that's happened, and I'll end here, but I'd also would care to talk about how both AMLO and Claudia Sheinbaum have been very lucky in their handling of Trump. And not just in their handling of Trump, beyond that. I mean, even with COVID beyond that, because it's striking that, in fact, the global pandemic benefited Mexico. That disruption of global supply chains really encouraged more of this so-called nearshoring in Mexico, getting away from especially those things that had been dependent upon China. Mexico, it so happens that the Mexican government was already committed to a major investment and expansion of its Pacific port in Manzanillo. Claudia Sheinbaum has really emphasized this, gone and made a visit to Manzanillo. This is another way of trying to reassure markets and foreign investors that Mexico remains committed to a very internationalized economic model, That has not changed in spite of everything else, and a lot else has changed, especially since López Obrador came to power and continuing with Claudia Sheinbaum being elected president and beginning to serve as president, is that Mexico has maintained basic continuity in terms of its economic model, of its new economic model, the one that left behind, that we associated with the previous administrations of the PRI. And I will just end it with this, saying that while on the one hand, there have been numerous reports that the US doesn't even have the customs capability at its ports to enforce these tariffs. There have been numerous reports that it's just not happening. There are big delays. There are container ships being turned around, that sort of thing. While Mexico is expanding its capacity to engage in global trade with the port of Manzanillo. I think that's practically a monument to the way in which this series of Mexican administrations have addressed both its own economic model, the world, and whatever happens coming from the United States.
Thank you, David. What is the current situation with the tariffs and Mexico? I understand that there is a negotiation going on. There was a threat against Mexico and Canada specifically, and that was delayed. What is the situation now for Mexico?
Yeah, the initial threat of 25% tariffs on everything, both from Mexico and from Canada, Trump dropped that. It seems that somebody conveyed to him, we have this trade agreement that you insisted on negotiating, the USMCA, somehow got him to agree. My guess on that would be he's got so many disputes going on with partners and other countries all over the world that they couldn't manage this, that it was a better bet to leave things in place with regard to the USMCA. That is, all imports that qualify under the USMCA regime, the content provisions, regional content provisions, it has to be over, 70% or something of regional content to come through. He backed off of the 25% across the board tariff and left USMCA in place. But besides that, there have been other threats, and there's been other movements up and down. The most recent major thing, not counting the threat, actually, the Trump administration has already abrogated the specific agreement regarding tomatoes, and the tariffs are going to be imposed on tomatoes as of July. But the most recent thing is that when those reciprocal tariffs, very ballyhooed reciprocal tariffs, to be imposed on every country in the world without exception, and sometimes saying that they would be permanent, Mexico was not on the list. It was left off the list. So at this moment, it is really, I think it'd be very hard to state with any certainty, has there really been an impact on those trade flows from Mexico to the United States at this point? Uncertainty is the key thing that everybody keeps talking about. It seems that there is this lesser dispute over tomatoes that's going to come to a head in the
there's an issue. There's an issue with water and the use of water,
well, yes.
right?
There's all of these other extraneous issues that don't fall under the category of trade. And here again, this is on the water question. This is also an example of the Sheinbaum administration really trying to appease, that is, trying to diffuse the tension and the threat. She has declared there will be more water diverted, that is sent over to the United States side from the Mexican side. But it's not only been that, of course, there's been the increased militarization of the border, allowing U.S. spy drones fly over Mexican territory. So this is such a vast and complicated relationship that both sides have a number of elements that they can deploy to try to either keep it on an even keel or increase great pressure. And I would say that for the most part, what we've seen on the Mexican side are measures to try to appease and to calm down and to assure Trump in particular that he has a stake in trying to keep things that way.
Yeah, for sure. Sunita, you have a question? Sunita? Okay,
Sorry,
it's
I
in the
was
chat.
trying to unmute.
Okay.
So apologies for that. How can Mexico's model of appeasement be used by other countries, or is it unique to Mexico because of our trade relationship?
Yeah, I would like to hear what everybody else thinks on this, because I've been thinking about it ever since Pilar contacted me for this
We will.
discussion. I frankly think that it has turned out, contrary to received wisdom going back nearly 200 years, or perhaps exactly 200 years in Mexico, that it was practically tragic to be a neighbor to the United States. And of course, Mexico lost more than half of its territory in a war to the United States. I think Mexico has been very fortunate, and things have actually turned in Mexico's favor in a way that I don't know that is reproducible by any other country. To a certain extent, obviously, Canada also being a neighbor. And it does seem that just simply their willful management of the relationship, that is the Canadians going to Trudeau, versus the way Claudia Sheinbaum has handled it, on that atmospherics level, although we never know what all is going on, what's actually being exchanged between the two, that really has increased tremendously the tension, obviously, between Canada and the US. It seems like it's never going to go back to where it was before, because Canadians and the world cannot have any sense of security that the US isn't going to elect somebody else like Trump again in the future. It could all come undone. But on the Mexican side, these are actual advantages. Just like, oddly enough, how Mexico actually benefited from the global pandemic because of the disruption of supply chains and the acceleration of nearshoring in Mexico. Right now, the fact that stipulating that uncertainty is very harmful for investment and for business decisions. But the fact that practically the whole rest of the world has trade troubles with the United States, and right now Mexico seems to be the exception, you can say in relative terms, this is actually helping Mexico. We're going to see if this actually turns into a net benefit. But who could have imagined that the COVID pandemic could turn into a net benefit? I think it did. And it's possible that this period of uncertainty might as well.
David, there's some questions in the chat. If you can answer them in the chat, that'll be great. I'm going to move on right now, but please stay around for more questions later on. Okay, gracias. Thank you very much. So let's go to Luis Alvarado. How do you see the relationship with Mexico from your vantage point, and how Trump changed from threatening to invade Mexico over fentanyl to now having a somewhat good working relationship with President Sheinbaum, sorry.
It's a pleasure being here, first and foremost. And David, great remarks. I totally agree with everything you said. I would like to add to some of that on that note. I would like to remind people also that for Claudia Sheinbaum, this is her first time being president of Mexico, where Donald Trump was president before. So there has been a relationship. And I would also remind people that when AMLO, the former president of Mexico, left, there was controversy. More than anything, there was a lot of questions. Why was he giving Ivanka Trump's husband the highest honor of Mexico, which is the Golden Eagle Award? And that's because there had been incredible amount of recognition of the importance of the relationship, economic relationship between Mexico and the United States, because Mexico, as of very recently, had become the #1 partner in trading with the United States, where China had been there before. So Mexico is growing leaps and bounds economically, but also socially. So when you look at the people that are migrating into the United States or were trying to cross the border, historically had been Mexicans trying to leave Mexico, looking for a better life. And now what you see is most of the people coming to the border are from South America and Central America, because Mexicans are enjoying a growth that is helping bring stability to Mexico. We all see the headlines about northern Mexico and the cartels and the fentanyl. And there's no hiding that, but Mexico as a whole, in the greater sense of Mexico, it's enjoying a very strong economy. Furthermore, just to finish my thought on the economic aspect of that, is that after both President Trump and President Sheinbaum get elected, it's only a few months difference between them taking power. And one of the things that caught my attention shortly after President-elect Sheinbaum was waiting to be sworn in, there was a parade of who's who in Wall Street coming to Mexico City to ensure that the relationship between Wall Street and Mexico remains strong. And there is something about Donald Trump having an eye on Wall Street to determine success or failure when it comes to economics. So the relationship between Wall Street and Mexico became very important, whereas in contrast, what you see in Canada, Donald Trump said it out loud. You know, they see Canada as just the 51st state of the United States. They don't see Canada as being dynamic in the change of the new global alignments as Mexico has been. So that is my point that I wanted to make from regards of the economic shift that has occurred now that both presidents have taken office in the last few months and are engaging in this new shift of internal political policies. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, Pilar, is what's important to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is the media president. You know, he's the guy from The Apprentice. He understands from being the mogul in New York that he can mobilize resources with the power of media. And I think that is one of the things that President Claudia Sheinbaum has been incredibly successful in understanding how Donald Trump sees the world, how he sees and triangulates his position as president, and how he negotiates with the rest of the world using the media. And Claudia Sheinbaum and the Mexican government and her team, and I have to congratulate her team, have been incredibly successful in anticipating what Donald Trump is going to do and not panicking over statements and actions that he has, because they have been very steady in the course and not reactionary as opposed to what you saw from Canada. A lot of the back and forth negative verbiage in Canada wasn't even from the Canadian Prime Minister. It was the governor of a specific state. I believe it was the state of Ontario or the region of Ontario. I don't know what they call them. And there was very bellicose exchanges that Donald Trump fed on and made them an enemy. Whereas Claudia Sheinbaum opened up and, like David said, almost appeased in regards to what Donald Trump needed to maintain the narrative that he has in making those changes internally here in the United States. So what you have is two heads of states using media as a diplomatic tool to find their place in ensuring that they each have positive avenues so they can both be successful in negotiating the terms of each and individual state. The other thing that I wanted to also mention is that Claudia Sheinbaum has been putting in incredibly large reforms inside Mexico as well. Donald Trump is doing the same thing and having a lot of pushback. For good or for bad, regardless of where you stand ideologically, both presidents are pushing a very rich agenda to ensure that their vision of their nations addressing the challenges of the global expansion are being successful. And I think the government of Mexico and their team are trying to find the language that coincides with that language that the White House can find to be that of a partnership. And that's why they've been able to mitigate all this feverish uncertainty that has come with the policy changes of this administration, and then the taking back of those policies and then molding them and from one day to the other. And what usually happens is diplomatic and economic entities around the world are getting backlash and have no idea how to handle it. Mexico's been doing this for a few years now, and Claudia Sheinbaum as president has been masterful in ensuring that their policies are also coinciding with changes so both nations and the relationship can stay strong. And they recognize that bilaterally, once again, being both the #1 trade partners of each nation is incredibly important for the success of their political processes and presenting their changes internally in their own nation.
There's a question by Araceli Martinez from La Opinión. Araceli, please go ahead. Araceli? Hello. Yes, go ahead.
Luis, good to see you there. Do you see any chance, any possibility that this relation between Trump and Sheinbaum can be broken? Because I had the idea, and many Mexicans had the idea that this can be gone wrong in any minute, that she's walking on eggshells. So, and we are very nervous about this. What do you think?
I think it's totally the opposite. I think that they have strength in each other. I think that they have found the right verbiage to work at the same time without sounding hypocritical to what their political messaging is in their own countries. I think it's that strength that they have found, that bond that they already had created. Because you see, Claudia Sheinbaum, you need to remember that for most of you, I know, Araceli, you know this, she was like the mayor, the title is mayor, but she was more like the governor of the strongest region of Mexico, which is Mexico City. So she was already part of the process under the last administration in negotiating these trade agreements between both nations. And both nations have found that these trade agreements have given them strength. Although internally, Trump and his team recognizes that. There are members in the MAGA movement who rather have the bellicose exchange because that fits the narrative strongly on Trump keeping power than saying that they're actually friends. But what we see and what we hear are two different things. And I think that's what I was trying to say, Araceli, that in the media, they're going to play their song and dance. But when they sit down and actually get to true business, they're very successful in ensuring that they're both representing their administrations in a strong way.
Okay, let's see. Peter, you had a question? Not sure. I think you had a couple. Do you want to ask?
Yeah, thank you, Pilar. I guess I'll just stick to the one question. I think another reporter had a question on China. I'm just curious about ideology. I mean, Morena is obviously a left-leaning party. GOP is hard right, and yet this doesn't seem to be complicating their relationship. And so I'm just wondering, what does this tell us about how Trump treats ideology, how Sheinbaum treats ideology? Does ideology matter in international relations, or is it more just transactional now? Thanks.
Luis,
Peter, and that's exactly the point.
2 minutes maximum, please.
That's exactly the point, right? And that's Trump talking to the TV cameras. And then when you see Trump sitting in a deposition, it's a different person. And it's the same situation when Donald Trump and his team talk to the people in Wall Street who have invested heavily in Mexico, knowing that the China relationship is more fragile than the Mexican-American relation. They're putting their eggs in Mexico. So Donald Trump sees that. So when the cameras are off, it's a different Trump. It's a different administration, and that's where the people sometimes you see in his administration, there's conflict between the people that carry the MAGA flag and then the people who actually have to administer the policies that keep the America straight. You saw Donald Trump when he put the tariffs up at first and the market started crashing. You know, there were modifications done at the drop of a hat. And that's because he listens to Wall Street. And Wall Street talks to Claudia Sheinbaum. And I think that's the difference between what the people see and what the people hear and then what the people see.
Thank you, Luis. And if you can answer anything in the chat, please go ahead. I'm going to move on to our next panelist, and that's Alberto Diaz-Calleros. Professor, welcome. Can you talk about the use of tariffs as a political tool and what you think Trump wants to achieve? Also, anything else that you want to talk about reacting to what's been said before? But please go ahead.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all of you for tuning in, and thank you, Luis and David, for giving so much good background on how to think about the relationship between Mexico and the United States. So there's three things, and thank you, Manu, for inviting me to this. I don't know if you're out there, but I want to point out three things that might be things that have not been so much mentioned in the media and the stories that we hear about the US-Mexico relation. So the first one is something that I wrote an article in El País already almost 2 months ago at the beginning of February. And what I tried to argue in that article is that one thing one has to understand about the way Trump is using tariff policy is that it is mostly, I would not call it quite coercive diplomacy. I think it is a strategic use of tariffs for goals that have less to do with the sort of the trade itself, but have to do a lot with the geopolitics. So the best way I can describe this and explain this is work that was done by a very, very important economist, Albert Hirschman, political economist Albert Hirschman, already 80 years ago, which most people don't read anymore. It's a 1945 book. He explains how tariffs were used in the interwar years in Europe as a way to construct coalitions and bargain with neighbors, and particularly used by Nazi Germany as a way to have this buffer zone around it with Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria. So I'm sorry that I'm going all the way back to 1945, but this work by Hirschman is incredibly insightful because it tells us also about the way tariffs within Latin America, in eras that we had less of this free trade environment, tariffs have always had this strategic element to them, the way they can construct friendly spheres and spheres of influence. And I think if we don't think about it in those terms, we are missing the point about what Trump is trying to achieve with a lot of the tariff policies. It is not necessarily about the direct effects on trade or the kinds of things that happens with investors in Wall Street. It is a lot about how the US will find its new footing in the world and its spheres of influence and where Mexico fits within this. And in some ways, this is kind of resonates a little bit with what David said earlier. Mexico is kind of getting lucky within these spheres of influence game because we might end up having the preferential tariff treatments that the rest of the world might not get. So that is something I, just wanted to start with this, sort of issue about really rethinking. Hirschman called them the influence aspect of tariffs, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book, which, as I said, people don't read anymore, but it is a very important book to understand the current era we live in. And one of the things he spends a lot of time is looking at the mix of trade concentration across industries and across today. Hirschman is famous for precisely the index we use to measure these kinds of things anywhere in the world when we think about concentration and diversification and fragmentation. So anyway, that's the first point. The second point has to do with Claudia herself. And it's a hard thing to read, of course, what's going on inside the politician's mind. I think this is something that I guess both Luis and David have set the stage in saying, we don't exactly know what happens when Claudia is in a one-on-one with Donald Trump, or what's going on through her mind. But one thing we do have to understand a little bit about her is that, contrary to what a lot of the media said about her, she is her own person. I think we have kind of accepted a little bit this media narrative and this narrative that came also from her opponents, in which the idea was that she was just that she was under the shadow of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that she was basically a puppet of the very popular president that Mexico had. And I think that just misses the whole point of how she used all this political skill and acumen to actually become the next president of Mexico. So it seems to me that this kind of understated, cool-headedness, she always repeats that in many of the things. Whenever something happens and whatever, she says, I'm going to keep a cool head. She's a scientist. She underplays this. She doesn't really never talked about during her campaign about this, but she's a Nobel Prize winner within the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. She's a scientist. She's been in Berkeley. She's trained in kind of cutting edge research and science in the best universities of the world, but she doesn't play that card necessarily in public. So I think she's a really, really tremendously skilled politician, and we really have to pay that, kind of more attention to that aspect of her, of how, in a way, she has. I would even dare to say that she has skills and elements that her predecessor AMLO did not have. AMLO was parochial. AMLO did not travel around the world. AMLO did not feel comfortable, playing in a world stage. Claudia can. The third point I will make is really about the risks that we face. And the risk is something that is, politicians are often very prone to hubris in many different ways. But the worst hubris for a politician might emerge when they have supermajorities, when they do not have slim, advantages in the political sphere. And one of the things that happens with political competition is that it disciplines you. It forces you to think hard before you make any decision. It makes you, try to double guess and think down the game. How are your decisions going to be playing out? So the biggest risk for Claudia, and I think there's a question out there in the chat about this, has to do with the supermajority of her party, Morena. We know from the, people have emphasized this throughout Latin America, that as, governments in Latin America have had bigger majorities, they start tinkering with the courts. They do, the judicial reform is a very important element of what's been happening in Mexico in the last few years, the last year. This kind of supermajority that Morena enjoys right now, with majorities that are unable to change the constitution, plus the enormous popularity of Claudia right now, more than 80%. She might be, I don't know the data, but she might be the most popular leader in the world right now. That kind of thing is extremely dangerous because it provokes this kind of lack of checks and balances and prudence. And that is the kind of risk I see down the line, that this majority of Morena might actually be the undoing of the kind of, the political incentives of this supermajority might actually be a very, her own kind of Achilles heel as we think about her in the future.
Thank you so much, Professor. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Nicole Shang. Nicole, you want to ask your question? Nicole Shang?
Yes, hi. I can ask my question. It's very simple. What impact does the relationship between Trump and the president of Mexico have on border region businesses? Because there are so many businesses out there and they're watching, what happened between two countries.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And not just on the border. I mean, these are the two main commercial partners of each other.
Sure.
So the whole country, right? So,
yeah.
Alberto, and then others.
If I can just, David might be able to talk more about this, but I think David set the stage very nicely when he reminded us, I put it in the chat, that it was the finance minister who actually facilitated this whole process with Luis Videgaray for the invitation of Trump to Mexico. And it tells you a little bit about how, it was not the foreign minister that was running foreign affairs, and it was not necessarily the trade minister that was running Nafta in different moments in Mexico's relationship. The finance ministry in Mexico has an incredibly important role to play on this kind of connections. And what I want to say there is just that there is no question, I think, in the mind of most Mexican observers that Mexico will not shift its, when NAFTA was signed in 1994, and even a little bit before that, when the World Trade Organization got, at the time, the agreements that were signed to create free trade in Mexico, free trade meant, yes, it meant being an open economy to the world, but more than anything, it meant really setting Mexico's destiny linked to the destiny of the United States. That is the basic, decision that was made in 1994, and that has not changed. The honeymoon that Claudia Sheinbaum was expecting in terms of economic growth was because of nearshoring, because the expectation was that an enormous amount of U.S. investment would go into Mexico to take advantage of the strategic location and the ports and the things that Mexico has to offer. Plus, I mean, we should remember, Mexico is no longer just a cheap maquiladora country. It is a country of highly skilled workers, enormous hours, except for South Koreans. They're the people that work the longest hours in the world today. And that is the kind of labor force, which is a skilled labor force that can produce in Tijuana. You have aerospatial industry, you have precision machines, you have medical equipment that is done in these, completely antiseptic, aseptic chambers. I mean, that's the kind of industry that Mexico is doing with the US, no longer this maquiladora image people might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Alberto. I don't know if David or Luis want to add anything to that.
Well, I haven't had the opportunity, even though I'm from the border. I'm from El Paso originally. What really struck me the last time I really had a chance, I did two different tours, actually one in on the California border with Mexico and one there in El Paso, where included every aspect of the cross-border relationship, which had already changed. In order to understand where we are today, you not only need to go back and understand, well, how did COVID affect the relationship, which it was very, very hard on cross-border traffic during the pandemic. But then before that, the enormous rise in insecurity on the Mexican side, as we know, this goes back to the Calderon administration, when the city across the river from El Paso, Ciudad Juárez, earned the reputation of being the most dangerous and violent city in the world. And that actually caused that is not just simply that with Juárez, but the war essentially on the cartels that was launched by Felipe Calderon in his presidency, that led to this vast increase in violence and in violent deaths on the Mexican side. It stimulated a lot of people on the Mexican side to move north of the border. And there was a time, I remember when in El Paso, it seemed like every Mexican restaurant in Juárez that depended upon people from the El Paso side to cross the border and to patronize it, moved to El Paso. And even presidentes municipales and other officials on the Mexican side, in more than one case, and certainly in the Juárez El Paso case, moved their family north of the border. So the relationship,
we need to move on,
really
please.
changed. Sorry?
Please wrap up. We need to move on to the fourth speaker who is with us already.
Yes, you should, by all means. But we've never seen a restoration of the free cross-border flows that existed prior to the war on drugs. So it was already something that has been significantly attenuated to this day.
Thank you, David. Thank you. So we welcome Larry Rubin. He just jumped into the call. And he is the president and chairman of the board of the American Society of Mexico. Mr. Rubin, welcome. I know you have been very involved in the issue of U.S.-Mexico relations during this critical time. Please tell us where we stand today in the situation, in the negotiations between the two countries.
Sure, Pilar, and thank you for the invitation. For the American Society that's been in country operating in this important relation for more than 80 years, since 1942. Of course, the changes have been important, and this relationship that Mexico and the U.S. hold is crucial. Obviously the tariffs that have been implemented worldwide have been of note for Mexico, but in reality, they do not have a lot of impact, and we represent all the U.S. businesses operating in Mexico as well, not only the American NGOs and the 2 million Americans, but in truth of the matter, we understand that, for example, the tariffs in steel also have a political nature in itself, and that have to do with the location of where the steel industry is and the Rust Belt, but in particular the ones that have to do with the auto industry, which is obviously the #1 exporter from Mexico to the U.S. Only impact about 2% of the total manufactured vehicles in Mexico going to the U.S. because the rest do comply with the USMCA requirements. So Mexico, in a sense, is shielded economically by these by the tariffs that have gone into effect worldwide, and part of it has to do with the strategic importance of Mexico. Of the 3 priorities of President Trump that have to do with drug trafficking, fentanyl, right, to be very specific, immigration, and the economy, Mexico plays a crucial part. Probably no other government or no other country plays such a crucial part as Mexico does. So because of this, Mexico and the U.S. holds a very particular relationship, Pilar, and I do believe that has been one of the strengths of Mexico and will continue being one of the strengths of Mexico, notwithstanding that the largest minority of Americans with another nationality is Mexican, right? I mean, 38 million Mexican Americans are living in the U.S., 12% of the U.S. population. So that obviously has an effect. But also in Mexico, 2 million Americans live in Mexico. So really the alignment between our 2 countries has been happening for decades now. And economically, well, the largest trading partner for the U.S. is Mexico. 15% of total trade is Mexico. The other 14% is Canada. So the region in itself has a very important impact. I've been involved in this relationship now for over 20 years, heavily involved between Washington and Mexico. The American Society is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization founded in 1942, right? And part of our goal is how do we bridge gaps between not only the 2 countries, but the 2 governments? And that's what we have been doing so far. I travel back and forth between Washington and Mexico all the time, but also Houston and Austin is important because 1/3 of the total trade between Mexico and the U.S. has to do with Texas. So we can't forget that Texas has a critical and geopolitical importance in not only the economic part of the relationship, but also regarding security and the other 2 goals of President Trump, which has to do with fentanyl and immigration. So we work very closely with Austin and with Governor Abbott, and we really strive. And our friends in the panel who are fantastic, and I would have loved to have joined you before if I didn't have this meeting with the secretary that I just left, is the fact that the strategic importance of Mexico and that of the U.S. for Mexico is and will continue being a top priority.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rubin. Let's see. Do you have any comments as to where is the public opinion? There's a question in the chat. Where is the public opinion toward the U.S. in Mexico today? Does it align with the conflict, with the relationship between the heads of state? How do you see the attitudes of the public in Mexico towards this situation?
Sure, Pilar, and it's a very good question. Actually, very interesting. It has been that it has changed. Basically, they're seeing the initiatives that both governments have taken as an opportunity for Mexico to improve its security. Security, as probably mentioned many times in this panel, has been a key issue in Mexico, right? Or actually, the insecurity has been a key issue in Mexico, and the fact that the U.S. government and the Mexican government are working hand in hand to curtail the huge drug cartels, now terrorist organizations, has been applauded by the Mexican public, because if you're in Mexico, we're always on the lookout for security threats. And unfortunately, they are real. I mean, there's obviously pockets in the country that are safe havens in terms of security, but there's others that are frankly very dangerous for Americans, Mexicans, and everyone. So the work that and the pressure that Mexico has received to improve security from the U.S. standpoint, because that obviously will fix not only the drug trafficking trade between both countries, but also immigration has a component of criminal organizations trying to get more immigrants into the border because they charge each immigrant $10,000 just to cross or just to take them to the border. So obviously it's a huge moneymaker for these now terrorist organizations. So actually Mexicans are happy because of it. And they're also seeing how Mexico and the US are working very differently from other countries. They're working hand in hand to be able to produce results for the population of both countries, of Mexico and the US.
Thank you. And I want to ask also, what's your take on what can you report to us about the reaction from businesses at both sides of the border, corporations, large and small? What are their concerns at this point?
Sure. Well, first off, part of the concerns do have to do with, or more importantly, have to do with the revision of the USMCA happening in 2026. And I'm fortunate that through the American Society, I get to participate on both sides of the negotiations. And I do believe that USMCA, which is very important for the US and very important for Mexico, will be successfully negotiated. One of the issues, or two of the issues that are very important in this negotiation, one of them has to do with the recent changes in Mexico of the judicial branch. And that does have an impact for US businesses and businesses as a whole, because the judicial branch seems to be not as independent as before. And obviously we all look to have a free and independent judicial branch. So that is one of the issues. And the other is the total implementation of the USMCA, according to what was agreed, where Mexico has not implemented fully the property rights and IPR, basically intellectual property rights, as it should. And that is a very important part of it. Actually, my meeting with the secretary today had to do with the implementation of this final part of the USMCA. And as I told the secretary, once Mexico implements it, it will be an additional positive point in the renegotiation of the USMCA in 2026. So it is very important. So that, I would say, Pilar, is the primary concern of both Mexican and US businesses alike.
But there is, and someone else talked about this before. I think one of the questions from one of the reporters was, how much longer until this relationship sours? Because as we know, Sheinbaum might be a person with very cool head, but Donald Trump is not that kind of person. So is there a threat there to this relationship that you can foresee if something else goes wrong and he decides to lash out with new tariffs?
I don't see it, and let me tell you why. I don't see it either from the US side or the Mexican side. And why? Because it's let's call it a marriage of convenience. Both countries need each other. President Trump understands the strategic importance of Mexico, not only in trade, but also in national security, that Mexico has a direct impact on the US national security. So for example, there's no household in the US that during dinner does not have a Mexican product on the table, for example. And President Trump understands this fully, and also understands that the US needs Mexico as much as Mexico needs the US. Today, supply chains are very well integrated. And let's say that all plants in Mexico, all US plants in Mexico would close and go to the US. That is improbable and impossible. First, because there's not enough workers to man these industries. And additionally, there's not enough truck drivers to take out the product from the plants. Today, the U.S. needs about 120,000 truck drivers that does not have today. So the deficit continues to grow, and that's where Mexico and the U.S. complement each other. And not only that, but the populations also complement each other. Mexican population is about 20 years younger than the U.S. population. So when you talk about plants, and more that those that require an important number of workers, well, you need a younger worker than what the U.S. offers today. So that is understood by the Trump administration, and we're very excited of working with the newly appointed U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Ron Johnson. And I do believe with my conversations is that he fully understands the economic implications of the bilateral relationship, and not only the security and other aspects of this very important relationship.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. We're just going to go around, and I know, Alberto, you raised your hand, but I'm just going to go around and give each of you a chance to say a last phrase, a last word, a last thought. So you can do that. And go ahead, Alberto, and then I'll ask David and Luis. And
so I actually have to say that Larry kind of got it immediately in his last comment. I wanted to mention about the new ambassador, Ron Johnson, and one of the things that has happened in Mexico historically, and I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying this, is the U.S. ambassadors to Mexico have very quickly become some of the biggest advocates for Mexico. They end up loving the country. They end up marrying into Mexicans. They end up, having lifelong friends there. And it's similar to kind of, I see Luis's masks up there, but it's about this culture that is so powerful, So somebody asked earlier on about what other countries can do. That cultural aspect, that very human aspect, I can see in 2 years, Ron Johnson being one of the most important advocates for Mexico, rather than a hawkish guy that wants to invade the country, So this is something that, I think it's important to put on the table, that there is this sort of intrinsic advantage that Mexico has because of the strength of its culture. And I'm sorry if I sound Mexican and nationalist. I'm not the academic scholar talking now. I'm the Mexican saying this, but I think that's one of the biggest assets Mexico has.
I think you're right. And I'm not Mexican, and I have a Mexican artist painting behind me. So that should tell you something. David, do you want to say a last phrase, last word? We have 2 minutes for
yeah, I think that to my mind, the biggest concern right now from a Mexican point of view, from Mexico's point of view, is that the sort of disruption that Trump has been and continues to bring to U.S. economic relations and the U.S. economy and economic policy is the threat of a recession. There are some economists who think that we are already in the early phase of a recession. It's just not yet reflected in some indicators such as unemployment or overall economic growth. That will definitely have an impact on Mexico if it happens. And I expected Claudia Sheinbaum actually to run into difficulties given the closing sexennial policies of the López Obrador administration. She had been promising to increase spending in a number of different areas, but in fact, Mexico had already gotten into deficit spending in the last year of the López Obrador administration. She has benefited from the fact that now Trump seems to be the source of any problem that could come up. But I think those problems could be very real if the U.S. goes into recession, which is at least a 50-50 prospect right now.
That's a good point. Mr. Rubin, you want to have a last thought for us?
Definitely. Thank you, Pilar. And I might appear bullish on the relationship today. I do think that obviously there's challenges, and Mexican government officials and American government officials think differently. In many regards, they're two very different cultures, of course. And even though we have similarities and ways of work that are aligned, naturally the challenges of the relationship will continue. But as Alberto was pointing out, having an ambassador that will likely promote the importance of this relationship also in Washington will be crucial. And you have a deputy minister right under Secretary Rubio, who used to be not only former president of the American Society, as all U.S. ambassadors are, but is now and used to be the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. Deputy Secretary Chris Landau is definitely a key player, not only in state, but is a very recognized voice within the Trump administration. And the exciting part of it is he really loves Mexico and understands Mexican politicians and those running the country today. So that's an added bonus, that not only do you have an ambassador that will be working hand in hand to make sure this relationship goes in the right path, but you also have the state wanting this relationship to head in the positive direction.
Thank you so much. Luis, you'll have the last word.
I'm going to elevate the conversation a little bit higher to the stratosphere. My perspective is what Trump is being elected and now putting these policies in place is a reflection to the global economy and the challenges of globalization in general. And we're suffering the pains, the growing pains of our world economies being interconnected to each other. And we learned that from COVID. I think what we need to do, I think somebody asked, what do you need to do as a journalist? Is I think you need to make a distinction between the political process, and that's basically politicians saying that they want to do something or going to try to do something, and the actual relationships and them building economic wealth for each other's nation. If you guys remember, Donald Trump said, I'm going to make everybody wealthy, because I think that's what Americans want to hear from him. But what Claudia Sheinbaum is doing is saying, I'm going to make everybody safe to Mexicanos, and that means economic growth and freedom. And what we need to understand is that Mexico is a strong partner with the United States by convenience, like it was said earlier, but we're here together. And as long as that relationship remains strong, both nations will remain strong and both politicians will remain successful.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Luis and Alberto and David and Larry. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to all our colleagues for being with us as well. Thank you.